All right. Well, our guest today is Dr. Sarah Lamer from University of Tennessee. Dr. Lamer, thank you for joining us.
You for having me.
We talked a little bit in class about your study looking at the transmission of nonverbal bias and the effects that has on kids. But to zoom out a little bit, can you just tell me a little bit about the research questions that most guide your work?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm mostly interested in how people form their stereotypes and especially how those can be formed from the environments that people share within a cultural group to kind of explain why so many people in a population come to share similar beliefs.
And can you, thinking about this project specifically, tell us a little bit about the history of it? What were the ideas floating around that made you decide to put this amount of investment in this type of work and explore this idea more fully?
Sure, yeah. So this interest originated, I suppose, from a few different angles. So, from the nonverbal bias angle, I was interested in how that could extend to other populations. So there's past work on nonverbal bias showing that people learn from patterns of nonverbal behavior. And that work was done with adults. And so I was interested in both whether it would extend to a nonverbal bias that reinforces gender stereotypicality, but also whether it would extend to the way that children learn information. And that relates to the other motivation for why I was interested in it, because I was interested in understanding some way that children learn gender stereotypes, because gender roles take on such an important part of children's ideas and identity. As young as like 3 years old, they really latch on to their gender identity, and that can soon have a lot of negative implications. And so, from both that like kind of applied angle and the nonverbal bias angle, that's how we came to wonder about this question specifically.
To kind of jump off one of the things you said there, I think it's interesting in your work that your primary outcome is more about people's awareness of stereotype beliefs or norms rather than their own personal endorsement of them. And we've talked about this in class, but I'm no expert on it, so I'd like to give the expert the opportunity to talk a little bit about that. So, why do you think it's so important to focus as much on people's knowledge of the existence of these stereotypes rather than strictly just personal endorsement?
Yeah, so we decided to incorporate norms as an important outcome in this work, based on past work with nonverbal bias that showed stronger effects on these sorts of outcomes, where it happened to be the outcomes relating to what people thought others kind of thought or valued. And so then we incorporated the felt pressure measure, and really found more consistent results there. Now, the reasons why norms are so important, I mean, there's lots of different literatures that support that, but norms seem to be especially important when people are behaving automatically. And the idea is that norms serve as kind of like an autopilot to direct you towards accurate behavior given the context. So when you don't have the cognitive resources to allocate to decide how you should behave, you have these norms to kind of indicate, oh, I should be doing this in this situation, given what other people would do here or other people want me to do here. And so norms can be really powerful, in a lot of different situations. And when we're thinking about subtle patterns in the environment that might shape people's beliefs, norms seem like a really important outcome there.
Right. Yeah. So thankfully, as the non-expert, that I think that aligns with a lot of the things we've been talking about in class in terms of, obviously, it's important to study what individual people believe, but that's not the end all be all of the way people behave. And oftentimes norms, as you say, can kind of serve as a default, something that we look to when we don't either have strong opinions or we feel like we're being regulated by others or we're on this kind of more autopilot set. So I think that understanding the importance of norms is hopefully something that's coming through in class. A lot of the work that we review in this class and in this work as well. So I thought, well, I liked all of your studies. I thought that study one was particularly clever as someone who likes to do a lot of methods-based research. So could you just give us kind of the bird's eye view of what went on in study one and what decided on you pursuing that kind of more archival path?
Yeah. So study one, we kind of quantified what kinds of characters kids are typically seeing and how those characters are treated as a byproduct of their stereotypicality. And so we kind of landed on that because when you go watch a kids show, there seems to be those four really common tropes of like the girly girl, the tomboy, the like really masculine macho guy, and then the like nerdy guy. And so it became like a really common set of four characters that we were able to pinpoint in a lot of these shows, that allowed us to get a really representative sample of what kids might be seeing when they're watching TV. And I really liked this particular method of grabbing shows and characters and things like that, because you can understand what lots of different kids are seeing across like socioeconomic status or what region they're in. The same, all these different kids are still watching, the same scenes in Scooby-Doo or the Disney Channel or shows or whatever. And so it's this kind of unique way to study culture and cultural influence that we don't get from a lot of other methods. And so that's why we wanted to tackle it with TV, and then understanding that there's this really common four set of characters allowed us to map how gender stereotypicality influences nonverbal behavior.
Right. And were you studying how other characters were reacting to these primary characters?
Yes. So the primary outcome was how other characters in the show treat the target characters that we selected based on their gender stereotypicality. And so my common example is Scooby-Doo, because I feel like lots of people know it across different generations. So, in Scooby-Doo, we had our four characters. We had Daphne and Fred, our gender stereotypical characters, and then Velma and Shaggy, our gender counter stereotypical characters. And so we selected a representative sample of clips from Scooby-Doo that were aired during the summer data collection. And then we cut out the target characters, those four characters I just mentioned, and we quantified how the other characters in each clip treated the target character depending on their gender stereotypicality. And then we did that across all the different shows we sampled.
Yeah, so reading this, I had a question about the shows that you sampled. Is it a combination of both cartoons and real life, like actual actors, right?
Yeah.
So, in some ways those are similar in that they're being presented to kids, but you can imagine that the source of the bias is pretty different when it's a real human actor, even though they're actors, right? They might not be perfectly controlled in all their small body movements. Whereas if it's a cartoon, in some way, every single thing that goes on the screen is a more conscious decision, at least a more conscious decision. So do you think it really matters whether it's a cartoon versus like actual human actors? And I'll just let you answer that question.
Um, we wondered about that, and so we tested it, and we didn't find any differences between cartoon and real actors, which is really interesting because it does cause you to question where the bias is coming in, or is it coming in at the actor stage, and then comparably like the animator stage. I feel like I'd need to interview like people who are a little bit more under experts in TV production to understand where all the levels of influence come in that
Right.
could be producing the bias. Maybe it comes in at like the production stage where it's just like, oh, this feels a little bit more right.
Right. It could be the same type of bias showing out in two different behaviors. The actor,
Right.
where they physically place their body in an expression of nonverbal behavior, and the animator in terms of how they draw that character in a way that they think is most natural or suitable. So it's just really the same type of association that's being played out, either literally how you're acting or how you're drawing. But you do that interview research because I'd be very interested to hear about it. But I thought it was an interesting kind of combination of two slightly different sources there. Um, being mindful of the time that we have left here, knowing more generally about this type of research, is there a specific future direction that you're particularly excited in pursuing?
We've thought about a few different directions for this work. One of my graduate students, Jillian Preston, and I were working on extending this across race, to kind of understand if different behaviors are positively elicit positive responses depending on both the gender stereotypicality and gender of the characters, but also their race. So kind of taking the agency backlash effects that vary by race and gender and see if that is reflected in the kind of interactions that kids are seeing in media. So that's the immediate one that we're tackling. But I think more generally, the nonverbal bias literature is ripe for a lot of questions about how nonverbal bias influences, whether it's like a single exemplar that people latch onto, or whether it's a cumulative effect if more clips equal a stronger impact, or if familiarity with the characters amplifies it, if like you're identifying with the characters, you get a stronger effect. So there's all those sorts of questions that would help kind of understand the social influence effects better.
What about change over time? Because you kind of have developed this method that, in theory, it should be possible to look at similar clips across different time periods. Those are decently well stored. Do you have predictions about whether this effect is changing over time?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I thought about it both like over time, how it's changing in different like generations of media, but also cross-culturally, how it might vary as well with the kinds of media people are seeing. I feel like media has taken an interesting turn, especially like televised media has taken an interesting turn over the past, I don't know, 8 years or so since streaming services kind of came into play, where now it's more that, so when we collected these data, it was more so that there was like main networks, and then you had a specific subset of shows that people would watch because of what was popular on those networks. But Netflix and Hulu, et cetera, introduced kind of an explosion of shows. And that means people have a little bit more control over what they watch. And so I think there's like pockets of different kinds of media, a little bit more tailored to what people's beliefs are. And so I think that there might be some changes over time, but it might vary based on like what subset of media
Right.
quantifying it in.
As well put. You're right. The media, present day media might be changing, but people's immersion with it might not be as strong as it was in years past. Say this as someone who's been forced to watch the 2006 movie Cars probably 15 times in the last month. So yes, right. There's some things that are just kind of timeless to kids, and they want to watch those things over and over again, even if they're carrying maybe these kind of messages from a long time ago. Last question, kind of zooming out even a little bit further, is there a topic or an idea that you think social psychology or intergroup relations research more generally should be spending more attention on in the years to come?
I think one of the themes in my own work is trying to map on what kinds of effects can happen in human cognition versus what kinds of effects actually do happen in the world and kind of account for people's learning. And so I feel like that's going to be a challenge for our field, is finding ways to understand what's actually out there in the world that's then shaping people's beliefs and actually accounting for change versus just like what can happen, what are possible effects that happen in the human mind. So I think that's certainly a challenge.
Right. Yeah. So we've gotten very good at designing these lab experiments that are very tightly controlled. And those really do have their value, but they're can be quite different from what people are actually seeing out there. And so that's equally well worth studying. So really like that idea. Well, Dr. Lammer, thank you so much for your time. And well, when you interview those animators, you'll come back on and tell us all about it. So thank you again.
Sounds good. Thank you.